She didn't scream when they grabbed her, she knew no one would hear anyway, until he did. The autumn rain drummed against the dormitory windows like desperate fingers tapping for help, masking the sound of Emma's footsteps as she hurried down the dimly lit corridor toward her room, clutching her biology textbook against her chest like armor that couldn't protect her from what was coming. The old Victorian dormitory seemed to breathe with malevolent life around her, its century-old walls holding secrets and shadows that had witnessed too many moments like this one, too many young women walking these halls alone and afraid. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead with the inconsistency of a dying heartbeat, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls like specters warning of impending doom, and she quickened her pace, her sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum that reflected her terror back at her in distorted fragments. The smell of old wood polish and industrial disinfectant couldn't mask something else in the air, the scent of predatory intent, of young men who had grown drunk on their own privilege and power, sensing the presence behind her before she heard the first whispered taunt. "Look what we have here," came the voice of Marcus Wellington III, the star quarterback whose $1 million smile and family connections had opened every door for him, whose charm fooled professors and parents and scholarship committees but couldn't hide his true nature from those unlucky enough to become his prey, and Emma's blood turned to ice as she realized the hallway had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual Friday night chatter of students mysteriously absent, as if the entire dormitory was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. She tried to reach her door, room 237, the safe haven that seemed impossibly far away now despite being only 20 feet down the corridor, her trembling fingers fumbling for the key while her mind raced through every self-defense technique she'd ever learned but never thought she'd need to use, but they surrounded her like a pack of wolves that had been tracking wounded prey, Marcus and his 3 closest friends, Bradley with his father's political connections, James with his trust fund arrogance, and Trevor whose family owned half the town, their faces twisted with cruel anticipation and the kind of entitlement that came from never facing consequences for their actions, blocking every escape route with practiced precision that spoke of previous hunts, previous victims who had never reported what happened because who would believe them against such upstanding young men from such prominent families. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape, her mouth dry as desert sand as she pressed her back against the cold brick wall, the rough surface catching at her sweater and reminding her just how trapped she was in this moment that felt suspended outside of time and morality. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm outside that seemed to mock her predicament with its fury, but they only laughed. That cold, heartless sound that echoed off the walls like breaking glass and seemed to strip away what little hope remained in her soul, and Marcus stepped closer, his 6-foot frame towering over her petite 5'3" build, his breath reeking of expensive beer and cheaper malice, his eyes holding the kind of darkness that made her understand why small animals froze when faced with predators. "No one's coming to save you, little mouse," he hissed, his perfectly manicured hand reaching out to grab her wrist with bruising force that would leave marks she'd have to explain away later if there was a later, and Emma's biology textbook, the same one she'd been studying from just hours ago, dreaming of becoming a doctor and saving lives, fell to the floor with a dull thud that seemed to seal her fate and mock her aspirations with its finality. The others closed in like a tightening noose, their shadows swallowing what little light remained in the corridor, and Emma felt her world shrinking to this moment of pure terror, her mind screaming for help that she was certain would never come because this was how these things happened, not in dark alleys with strangers but in familiar places with faces everyone knew and trusted, evil hiding behind Letterman jackets and family names and community service awards. Then, through the haze of fear and desperation, she heard something that changed everything, footsteps, calm and measured, approaching from the other end of the hall, and a voice that cut through the darkness like a blade of pure steel, "Let her go." The words weren't shouted or screamed, but spoken with such quiet authority that even Marcus hesitated, turning to see who dared interrupt their twisted game, and there stood Daniel, a quiet junior from Emma's chemistry class, someone she'd barely noticed before this moment but who now seemed to fill the entire hallway with his presence. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, didn't carry himself like a fighter or a hero from the movies, but something in his eyes, a fierce, unwavering determination, made the predators step back instinctively, like animals recognizing a greater predator in their midst. "This doesn't concern you, Anderson," Marcus snarled, trying to regain his composure, but his voice wavered slightly, uncertainty creeping in as Daniel continued his steady approach, never breaking eye contact, never showing even a flicker of fear despite being outnumbered 4-1. "It concerns me now," Daniel replied, his voice steady as stone, and he positioned himself between Emma and her tormentors, becoming a human shield forged from pure courage and moral conviction. "Walk away, or I make this everyone's business, starting with Dean Morrison and your scholarship committee." The threat hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Emma watched as the confidence drained from Marcus's face, replaced by the ugly realization that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "You have no proof of anything," Marcus spat, but he was already backing away, his friends following his retreat like the cowards they'd always been beneath their bravado. "I don't need proof to ask questions," Daniel said, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness, "and I don't think you want me asking them in front of the right people." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, the tension so thick it was suffocating, until finally Marcus cursed under his breath and jerked his head toward the exit, leading his pack of wolves back into whatever shadows had spawned them, but not before shooting a look of pure hatred at Daniel that promised future retribution. The moment they disappeared, Emma's legs gave out, and she crumpled against the wall, her entire body shaking as the adrenaline crashed through her system like a tidal wave of relief and terror combined. Daniel was beside her instantly, his large hands gentle as butterfly wings as he helped her steady herself, his eyes filled with a kindness she'd never seen before, not directed at her anyway. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft now, all the steel melted into warm concern, and Emma shook her head though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Her wrist throbbed where Marcus had grabbed her, and her heart felt like it might explode from the residual fear. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full weight of what almost happened crashed over her, and she looked up into Daniel's face, seeing not just her rescuer but someone who had risked everything for a girl he barely knew, someone who had seen evil and chosen to stand against it despite the personal cost. He helped her to her feet, retrieved her fallen textbook, and walked her to her door, waiting patiently while she fumbled with shaking hands to unlock it, never once making her feel weak or ashamed for falling apart. "Will you be okay?" he asked, and Emma nodded, though they both knew she wouldn't be, not really, not for a while, but she would be alive and whole because of him, and that was everything. In the days that followed, Emma learned that Daniel had quietly reported the incident to the proper authorities, had somehow convinced 2 other witnesses to come forward about Marcus's past behavior, and had single-handedly triggered an investigation that would eventually lead to Marcus's expulsion and the disbanding of his toxic circle of friends. But Daniel never spoke of it, never sought recognition or praise, simply returned to his quiet existence in the chemistry lab and the library, as if saving someone's life was just another Tuesday for him. Emma tried to thank him properly, tried to find words adequate for what he'd done, but every time she approached him, he would simply smile that gentle smile and change the subject, deflecting her gratitude like it embarrassed him to be called a hero. Months later, at graduation, as Emma walked across the stage to accept her diploma with honors, achievements made possible because she'd been able to continue her education instead of becoming another casualty of campus violence, she spotted Daniel in the crowd, clapping quietly for her success, and she realized that some people aren't put on earth to be celebrated or remembered in history books, but to be guardian angels walking among us in human form, appearing exactly when they're needed most. Asking for nothing in return except the knowledge that darkness didn't win that day. She never saw Daniel again after graduation, heard he transferred to MIT on a full scholarship for biochemistry, but sometimes, on quiet evenings when the world felt too cruel and hope seemed impossible, Emma would remember that moment in the hallway and know with absolute certainty that there are still people willing to stand between the wolves and the innocent, still souls brave enough to speak truth to power. Still hearts pure enough to risk everything for a stranger's safety, and in a world that often forgets the power of simple human decency, that knowledge was everything, a whisper of kindness that echoed through time, reminding her that even one act of bravery can stop darkness, and one kind soul can indeed save a life.